So I'm the worm somehow, yeah, in your picture. So eating also through the compost, through the soil in some way, eating in a way to explore something new, as scientists should do. And I would like to share with you some recent, more recent data that I incorporated in our monitoring of Lower Austrian soil. So we are, as some of you may know, we try to enhance our knowledge about Lower Austrian soils year by sampling more sites, usually 200 to 300 sites per year, for a couple of years already, repeating an initial measurement, monitoring exercise that had been done in 1990-91, so the Lower Austrian soil inventory. We have the archived samples, thanks to Erwin, here in Tulln. So huge treasure, I would say. Going back to the sites, and we have been collecting a lot of topsoil samples during the past few years, and we can now use those data to check on the implementation of possible soil health law, so which is now really connecting my talk to your talk, Keith, very closely, in order to learn about the whether this is operational, how we can implement thresholds, indicators, what is the meaning, and at which special level we can explore soil health in a meaningful way. So that's about the talk, the main content of the talk. So where's the, oh, sorry, here. Yeah. Okay, so I will briefly talk about the concept of soil health, indicators and requirements for soil monitoring, requirements for these indicators to be useful in soil monitoring of soil health. And then I will try to explore the soil health concept for our Lower Austrian data set that we have been generating and are still complementing in the future and currently. And I will go through, of course, some basic information of Lower Austrian soils, and then, according to the approach of the European Union, try to address the different soil threats that have been identified. Unfortunately, not all of them. So soil biodiversity as such is still very difficult to measure. I will come back to that. And also, salinization, it's not a main issue in Lower Austria. We are protecting such soils, so I'm not really incorporating data on that here. So let's come to the definition of soil health. I think I can just refer to what Keith said before. It's simply connecting soil properties and the status of soil to ecosystem services, and not just soil fertility or soil quality as it was done in former times. So it's an expansion of the soil quality concept, basically, we could say. And what we can do in order to identify soil health is to find soil health indicators, basically soil properties, like pH, like organic carbon, and try to benchmark them against so-called thresholds of soil health. And of course, now, again, you talked about, Keith, about science and policy, politics. What is science here? What is also politics? Yeah? So if I set a benchmark, it's to some extent arbitrary as well. Yeah? And we have different proposals in this context. So that's what we should keep in mind. It's not pure science if I compare my data to a certain benchmark. I could perhaps use another one. Yeah? And to some extent, we still do not have good benchmarks for some of the indicators. Or perhaps we do not even have a good indicator, as I said before, for soil biodiversity and some others. Okay. That's another way to try to show how soil properties are connected to soil functions, ecosystem services, and finally, what society is interested in human well-being. That's perhaps also some of the criticism of the soil ecosystem service concepts, that it is very centered to human beings. So perhaps we should expand it more also to the planetary health. And you know, the one health concept probably, it's relating soil environmental health, or trying to combine soil environmental health with human health and what they call now planetary health in more recent publications. So it's about the equilibrium of our planet to have a sustainable way to live on our planet here. Yeah. So scientists have tried to relate key soil properties listed here, like soil organic carbon and so on, and also physical properties, biological properties, to the different ecosystem services and soil functions. And these crosses here basically try to indicate which of the soil properties is relevant for the various ecosystem services. Again, you could discuss some of that here, but it's showing that some properties like organic carbon are just fundamental to almost any of those ecosystem services, and certainly should be included in monitoring of soil health. And in this particular slide here, we can recognize some of the key aspects of soil health indicators that they should fulfill the requirements. So this should be sensitive, they should change rapidly, relatively rapidly, to be monitored within a reasonable time frame. Changes should be large enough to be statistically relevant. Yeah. So, also, in case you just mentioned that, I think you said 60 to 70% of the soils in Europe are unhealthy according to scientific assessment, but of course you have some uncertainty in that. By the way, also probably some definition aspects, what is unhealthy again. Yeah. Anyhow, it's a tool to discuss about it. So it should be sensitive, it should be relevant, of course, so in relation to ecosystem services and soil functions. There should be some connection to management and management changes, and there should be, and that's a problem of biodiversity indicators in particular, and also soil compaction and some physical properties. It's not always easy to determine them reliably in a cheap and quick way. Yeah. So that's some of the obstacles of soil health monitoring that are shown here as well. And some of the properties, the bold, dark ones, black ones, they are particularly important also beyond soil quality for crop production. Yeah, so they are really important for many ecosystem services, as I said before. And those that are in this white arrow, they are still creating problems in terms of assessment. Yeah? So they need further development, more science to come up with better, easy to determine indicators that are also meaningful. And diversity, I would also like to stress that, according also to the European papers in this context, it doesn't mean only biota. Yeah? So we are talking about biodiversity. It means also diversity of soils, of soil properties, and of the chemical, the molecular and structural diversity of organic matter. Yeah? So that's something we should keep in mind here. Yeah, and now finally, before I show you some of the data that we created, I would like to display here this principal approach. So when we do monitoring of soil health, we have the factor of time. In our case, we have 2 time points, 1990, 91, more than 30 years ago, and in the few recent years, we resampled those sites. And we can now compare, if available, against thresholds of soil health. So below or above a certain threshold, the soil may be considered unhealthy or less healthy, and in the other case, it may be okay and healthy. And we may observe now no changes either in the unhealthy or in the healthy status, or we may see trends or changes moving towards a better soil health status or the other way around. Yeah? So that's what we could observe, and from which we could draw conclusions then hopefully for politics, yeah? Which is perhaps the main obstacle in many cases. Yeah, and the European Union in this discussion on the soil health law, and we as experts are always asked to give input within 1 day. It's really a problem, yeah? So they ask us within 1 day to a lot of pages of open questions. I would like to put this criticism here as well, because the questions are often meaningless, yeah, for me. I would like to see a soil health law proposal, which I can criticize or say it's good, yeah, or improve, make suggestions. So the process is a little bit doubtful for me, but I think it's an important process to come up with some more holistic assessment, yeah, of the status of soil in relation to ecosystem services, and what they propose along the soil threats that had been defined in the European soil strategy already before. Along that, and I will go along that in the following, we can have the indicators, so like for organic carbon, the decrease in SOC, if it's going to the wrong direction. Of course, we could also observe increases, hopefully, and we can then set thresholds, and they may be depending on other soil properties in some cases, yeah, if to become meaningful really, and I will also come back to that. Yeah, and now to Lower Austria, to our monitoring program. That's the well-known soil map. I think it's also in our materials here, and you probably all know already that Lower Austria is having a large share of agricultural, cultivated area in the northern, northeastern, and southeastern parts, and a larger share of grassland in some other regions. And this is relating, of course, to climate and soil. We have a lot of Phaeocenes and Chernocens here, and also here, and a high diversity. I'm coming back to the diversity of soils from these Chernocens and Phaeocenes in the lowlands towards even potholes in some northwestern parts of Lower Austria in Waldviertel. And my approach now to look at the data, so we have collected, overall, we have recollected, I think, 1,200 sites already, and more sites to come. We have sampled 230 already this year. The data not included here yet. So covering almost all of Lower Austria in the meantime. And I'm presenting the data according to land use, of course. So soil health is related a lot to land use, like grassland or cultivated land. I'm not including forest because we don't have data here, unfortunately. And on the other hand, to ecological conditions, climate and soil conditions, which are varying across Lower Austria. And I think a meaningful approach could be to look at main agroecological regions. So they are also part of our statistical reports in Austria. By the way, Lower Austria would be one of these nuts region, which was proposed by the European Union as a basic spatial unit to be monitored. Yeah? But we could go deeper here, and the main ecological regions are shown here. They're indicated by the first number, and we are sharing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have split the biggest one here in the northeastern part into 2 for some good reason. And within each of these main regions, we have sub-regions, sub-ecological regions, Kleinproduktionsgebiete in German. Yeah? And we are, I'm now trying to show you some information on the soil monitoring results for the different relating to the different soil threats using indicators mainly that have been proposed by the European Union, also thresholds, but in some cases also from literature. Before, I would like to show you some data on soil texture, which is not really sensitive to change. Yeah? So it's not really something where we expect changes, but it's a kind of capability factor, which can help us to interpret other data like organic carbon changes in a better way, because the storage of organic carbon, but also buffer capacity against acidification, they are relating to soil texture, to clay content, for instance. Yeah, and now some results on organic carbon. So the soil threat addressed here is soil organic carbon loss. And what we're interested in is, of course, the change in organic carbon over time, so during these 30 years. And the green areas are showing what we could consider healthy, according to thresholds that I have taken from European papers and some other sources, sometimes also from Austrian. We have a lot of information, yeah, so from Austrian information and norms. And what we can see is that cultivated and grasslands, of course, differ. It's unexpected. We have higher organic matter in organic carbon in grasslands, and that relates also to a more likely healthy status of such soils, if we use the concept of the European Union here. What we can also see is that changes in land use, like the change to more permanent grassland always means permanent grassland here, can produce a relatively quick improvement in organic carbon here. So that's something we can take from that. If we look at the variability among ecological regions here, you can also see huge differences relating to climate, relating to soil texture, to other soil factors, and land use, of course. I have indicated also permanent grassland share within a region in relation to the samples we have taken. Yeah? And so we can see increases in some regions, in some main ecological regions, and we can see little change in other regions, and we can also see differences in terms of health status if we apply the approach. Yeah? Given the time, I can't go into the details here, but what I want to show is that we can learn something more if we go down to a more detailed spatial level, in terms of management also. And if we go even deeper into the sub-ecological regions, Kleinproduktionsgebiete, within a given main ecological, agroecological region, we again see substantial differences in terms of the status and also the development of organic carbon over time. And I think that's very meaningful for management and for taking policy action here. If we just see the average, more or less, of a bigger region, we may not learn where we need to apply our action in the best case. Yeah, and we can go through the main ecological regions here, and we'll see quite some differentiation at this sub-level, this Kleinproduktionsgebiet level. Yeah. Same, for instance, for the northern part of the northeastern lowlands of the nordöstliches Flach- und Hügelland. So some of the sub-regions, some of the sub-regions, they are in the red shaded area, so they would be considered unhealthy. In other regions, you have a relatively large share of healthy soils, according to this concept. Generally, that's one of the regions with a real problem in terms of organic carbon, as we already know, but we can look at it in more detail here, and we can also see some regions tend to improve, some regions tend even to decline a little bit within this main ecological region. And that's just the northern part of this region, yeah? So I'm moving on. What we also looked at, that's something which is not considered in the European papers at that point, but in some publications, is the fractionation of organic carbon and the change of fractionation. So what we might be interested in is the stable fraction, less than 20 micrometer fraction of organic carbon. And there's a very limited number of samples here, so it's not representative for Lower Austria at all. But what if we expand this analysis, and we are doing that at the moment, we can see that we may find perhaps some increase in less stable fractions in some cases, while there is not much change, or perhaps even a slight decline in the stable fractions. So the total organic carbon is not telling the full story, of course. But that's already almost a sophisticated approach for a bigger monitoring program if you go into such details. Now come to nutrient loss, which is another soil health aspect to be evaluated here. I have plotted here the data on phosphorus, available phosphorus, the calcium acetate lactate extract, which is commonly used in Lower Austria, in Austria in general, potassium as well, in the same extract, and I have also looked into silicon, which is not a essential nutrient, but is a stress alleviating nutrient, and it's, yeah, in fact it's essential in some way. No plant without silicon in the real world. So we can see, just to stress a few aspects, we can see in grassland soils, so we have these differences in land use again, and in grassland soils, for instance, an increase in potassium, otherwise not that much change. We can also see the share of healthy and less healthy soils here in terms of nutrient availability. And this potassium increase in grassland soils probably could be related to a decrease in pH. Yeah? So it's not always easy to interpret such data, but in this case probably we have a change to the worse, we could say, in grassland soils that on the other hand improves another soil health indicator very likely. Also an interesting aspect to look at. If we apply this relatively simple approach of just comparing two thresholds. Yeah. Anyhow, yeah, acidification varies also. The trend of acidification, generally soils are stable. Grassland soils tend to decrease in pH, probably because of less input of lime, of some fertilizers in some regions. But we have also variation, of course, across ecological areas. Now, soil pollution, metals first. The soil rate of soil pollution. We evaluated here the total concentrations of heavy metals in soils, including also arsenic. And more or less, I would say, no problem in Lower Austria overall. And what we see, however, is an increase in copper in the northeastern lowlands. Yeah? So there is some indication that we have a problem with copper inputs in agriculture in some areas. Probably because the potatoes, apart from wine, from vineyards, potatoes they are treated with copper. Yeah, so that's something we observe here. From projects together led by the Environmental Federal Agency of Austria, where also federal provinces have contributed, like Lower Austria. We have data on also emerging and persistent organic pollutants from limited number of sites because of the effort, the costs involved in terms of sampling and particular analysis. Generally we find no big problems here, just in a few sites in forests and some agricultural sites. Yeah, somewhat increased levels of some compounds indicated here, deriving from flame retardants and in cultivated soils also from pesticides. But the status is there's not much of a concern at that point, but it's also a limited number of sampling sites that we have included here. Now moving to soil erosion, that's data from Peter Strauss. I'm not so sure if he's here already or coming today. So taking from reports produced for the regular periodic assessment of the common agricultural policy programs implemented in Austria by the ÖPOL program. And we can see in the different main production ecological regions very different soil loss rates here, in megagram or tons per hectare and year. And if we benchmark that against 2 megagram per hectare and year proposed by the European Union as acceptable, it's perhaps still not sustainable, we see that basically all except one region are clearly above, sometimes really much above that level. Yeah? So that's certainly one of the main problems that we are facing. However, also the area that is affected should be considered in this context. Yeah? Soil compaction, one of the different or difficult soil threats to be monitored because sampling undisturbed soil, and Willy Loiskandl is here, it's an effort. Yeah? It's not that easy. Of course, there are other possibilities like soil resistance as an indicator and others, but there's not really a monitoring program available at the moment on that. So I'm using some data that we generated where we compared as a benchmark against hedgerows that we will visit today, yeah, in the afternoon. And we can see that cultivation, of course, as we know, increases bulk density, compacts the soil, and probably we have a major problem here in some of the subsoils, especially due to the use of heavy machinery. But that's not a representative sampling, so we can just derive some information from that. Soil sealing, finally, land take and soil sealing have been also defined as a soil threat, and there are certainly major soil threats as soil functions, ecosystem services are more or less destroyed by turning land into infrastructure like housing or traffic lines. And data taken from our Federal Environmental Agency's data set, and we can see a decrease in land take, which is good over time. I also found some information from a Lower Austrian governmental person, which is deviating a lot, very recent. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I just want to mention that because we need to, if we talk about soil health assessment and the proportion of soils that are healthy, we need to have a common understanding of the database. Just interesting, yeah. Okay, and of course we can benchmark against total areas proposed by the European Union, but perhaps sometimes more meaningful it's to look at or relate it to the permanent settling space that is available, which is very different in different provinces, and like Tyrol, for instance, I think not much more than 10% is permanent settling space. So the competition is limited to this area between different land use types. Yeah, and finally, to conclude, so the Lower Austrian case study, perhaps highlights the possibility of implementation of soil health monitoring, also some of the difficulties that we are facing, but I think we can address a lot of the aspects that are probably included in this in a European soil health law in the future. And we can identify some of the main problems. It's certainly soil erosion, sealing and land take, organic carbon in some areas with a large share of cultivated soils. Soil compaction, we have little data on that, but I'm pretty sure about that. And for instance, copper in some specific regions that tends to increase substantially. We have pronounced regional differences at both the level of main agroecological areas and sub-areas. That should be considered probably if we like to use those data in a way to improve the situation. Yeah? So it would help us to concentrate our efforts on the real problem areas here. Scale of soil health assessment therefore would affect the outcome and the relevance of data. And I believe that sub-ecological areas, Kleinproduktionsgebiete, might be a pretty good choice in our case, balancing between efforts and costs of the program, of the monitoring, and the relevance for taking action. And because this is still a matter of a lot of discussion in this whole process of coming to a European soil health law. And there's a need for a more in-depth check of meaningful soil health indicators and thresholds in some cases. And we have to acknowledge that some aspects, some soil threats are difficult to address here because we don't have the appropriate methodology, simple methodology to apply. And now a more general conclusion relating to the implementation or this process of soil health law, coming to a soil health law at the European level. Some of my observations here also. I think it's very important that soil health assessments at national but also EU level should make use of existing information and knowledge and existing monitoring programs. So they cannot, Lucas or so cannot go that deep into the details, I guess. And it cannot build on, for instance, the archive samples and the measurements that we had. And there's this discussion of harmonization. Yeah, we also had this discussion last week during the Austrian Soil Science Society's annual meeting, and I gave also a presentation on organic carbon there, and then we had a workshop. And I feel that harmonization of methods, especially of analytical methods, it's not a priority. We can convert data. A lot of organic carbon is measured anyhow in a very similar way, or even with the same methods nowadays in almost any European country. And we can convert different methods probably by kind of what we call transfer functions. Yeah. So we shouldn't put too much effort on that. We should rather look at the development of meaningful indicators and thresholds, converting thresholds then according to methods where appropriate. So that's a plea because that was also the problem of the first try to come up with a framework directive. It was methods, harmonization of methods, and I don't think that's the key point. That's scientists just focusing on themselves, earthworms looking at themselves, yeah? And if we connect to society, we need to solve the problem, yeah? So we should focus on that in the soil health law. And yeah, of course we can list some preferred methods, so in the long term we may come to some harmonization, but we shouldn't throw away our own data and the information that we have. Yeah, some thresholds need to be more developed, and the discussion should really focus also on this spatial scale. Yeah, so as I could show, the spatial scale makes a big difference in terms of what you learn from your data and how you can implement action based on such data finally. Yeah, and we suggest, I suggest here as a first approach to go down probably to the sub-ecological regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Of course, many people contributed.
Walter, it was a great speech, and also it was nice that he mentions that the fungi are also needed, and the bacteria and worms should not only focus only on the worms. We are a team, and we have to learn from one another, and we know that we need all the other persons. And it's a pleasure for us that we have these archive samples. We have this for all Austria. We have it here in Tulln. No? So Keith, we are happy that you come to Tulln, because we have the archives of whole Austria here. And Walter is, we brought it together, and so we can make science and research, because we have the data from 1990. And so we really can say what is the changes, not only make one measurement. And I'm happy for this presentation. Are there any questions before we make a break? Please, Thomas.
I want to introduce my question with a little story. It's okay. A few weeks ago, we had a similar presentation about the Styrian guy. They also did or they want to redo their inventory. And the main message and the first sentence he told us, we did in the 90s something like 1,000 or 1,100 samples. Now we wanted to do it again, and we only found 600 of these 1,000 original samples. The rest is parking place, supermarket, or something like this now, so more than 1/3. And the question is, did you also compare the number? How many of the initial points did you find?
I didn't calculate yet, but you saw this change. That there is certainly some, at least 10–15% where we could not take the sample again. I don't think it's that much in our case, yeah. But I will be able to calculate it as well. It's certainly some of the things that I want to do. I excluded those sites, of course, now. Another thing is also change in land use. I showed some data, yeah. So in some regions you have quite some move from cultivated to grassland, yeah, to permanent grassland, or from ley to grassland. That's another thing that is of interest, yeah. But we can of course recalculate that. But unfortunately, it's some of the I just included new data, so it needs more time to explore the whole data set also for additional questions like yours. It's very relevant, yeah.
What other questions? If not, we will take a break, and then we continue with the reports of our network partner. Please take the coffee, and when I play the trumpet, we will start again.